Welcome to this discussion on the India China standoff and a little understanding about where we are, why are we here, and what is the way ahead. If we look at the current developments towards the end of June, it's clear that India and China are in the equivalent of a very tense standoff. And the symbol of this standoff is the tragic loss of the lives of 20 army personnel in the Galwan Valley in the eastern Ladakh region. Perhaps a look at the map would give us a slightly better idea about the nature of the problem and why India and China are in this particular standoff. If you look at this map, for instance, you will find that there is a long unresolved territorial and border dispute between India and China, which is quite old now. You may recall that India and China had a brief border war in October 1962. And from then to now, if you look at the map, from the high Himalayas, where you see Aksai Chin on the map, which is area that is controlled by China, but it is claimed by India as being part of the composite state of the erstwhile, that is the former state of Jammu and Kashmir, which had joined the Indian Union in October of 1947. So India's claim on that is legitimate. It's a very strong claim. Yet, for historical reasons that we'll address later, this is currently controlled by China because Pakistan had ceded this to China in 1963, but we'll come to that later. So I just wanted to give you all an idea about the topography and the length of this unresolved territorial and border dispute for India. So it is from the high Himalayas, where Aksai Chin is, which abuts what is called as the Kashmir region. It comes down, moves eastwards, and then you'll find that we come to Nepal, the sovereign entity nation Nepal. And this particular line between India and China moves along Tibet, which is again currently accepted as a part of China. And we will not talk about the domestic dynamic within Tibet. That will come later, hopefully. And then we have another length between Nepal and Bhutan, where if you see it on the map, it's moving up, it's coming south, and then moving up again towards Bhutan. And then you come to the east, the beginning of that particular sector, the eastern sector as it is called, which is from Tawang all the way to the extreme east, where we have the border with Myanmar. So this is the length of this unresolved territorial border area dispute in many ways, and it's almost 3,500 kilometers. So this is the background. Now, why do India and China have what is called as a line of actual control? The reason is as follows. Number one, India and China are what are called as civilizational states, meaning that they have a very complex history. They are ancient civilizational states, meaning that if you look at the history of China, you look at the history of India, they go well back into the BC period by thousands of years. And in 2020, these are the only two large states that have such strong civilizational roots. There are other ancient civilizations, but they have not survived into the modern period. So we won't get into that except to note that in Asia, India and China are two very ancient civilizational states that acquire their modern identity after the period of colonialism. India and China are differently subjected to colonial rule and the excesses of colonization by the colonial powers. And India becomes independent in August 1947. And concurrently, as we are aware of Indian history, Pakistan is also created at that time. And the erstwhile, what is called as the British Indian Empire, now becomes new independent modern states, of which the biggest is India. Then you have Pakistan. After the 1971 war, we have Bangladesh, we have Sri Lanka. And now in South Asia, we also talk about Nepal and Bhutan and the Maldives. So this is the modern construct, that we have a South Asia, of which the largest nation is India. And again, if you look at the geography, none of the South Asian countries, members, are contiguous to each other, meaning that they are part of the region only through India. None of them share a border with each other. This is one of the distinctive features of the region. And yes, some of them do have a border with China. You can see that on the map. Nepal, for instance, has a border with China. Pakistan has a border with China, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and as you go right towards Myanmar. Now, what happened between India and China is that because these were civilizational states, had gone through the privations or the excesses of colonization, there was no demarcated boundary. And this, by the way, is not something that is very new. As countries go through their own political trajectories, boundaries are formed, boundaries are accepted, boundaries are contested, and therefore there is tension. Sometimes countries go to war. So, as far as India and China are concerned, I would say that being civilizational states, they had frontiers. They did not have borders. Borders is a relatively new concept, even in terms of global history. That, if I could convey this very briefly, we have something called the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe. The modern nation state and a concept of a border emerges from there. In the Asian context, the colonial powers took some arbitrary decisions and created buffer zones, frontiers, and so on. Topography is also a very important element when we talk about borders and frontiers. Historically, countries have decided that when they formed and they had conquered territory, that they would follow the geographical principle, say hypothetically, of a river. For instance, between the former Soviet Union and China, one of the regions you find that the border was traditionally demarcated across a river. Sometimes it can be the ridge line. If you go along a mountain ridge, the highest point of the ridge is considered to be the boundary, and both sides have to accept. So my point is that you can accept the geographical principle, or you can come up with some new other arrangement that is agreed by both sides. In the Indian case, when India became independent in 47 and China became the modern communist state in 1949, the new leadership in both these countries had inherited their own histories. They had a image of themselves. They had what is called as a self-image. Now, this self-image sometimes is painted in very grand historical narratives where you imagine that there was, say, the Chinese Empire, at the height of its political power. Or in India, we had different empires. For instance, we had the Mauryan Empire. And you come down through history till you come to the Mughal Empire. You had in peninsular India dynasties like the Cholas, the Pallavas. They had very rich histories, the Satavahanas, who go into the BC period, and so on. But for the modern leadership in China and India, it was very complex because there was no agreed border. So from the period 1949, that whole decade to 59-60, some attempt was made by both sides. They tried to find their maps. Then they said that their maps had to be revised. And the real problem was the mountainous terrain in the Himalayan area. And then, of course, the eastern sector, which is where we have today India's Arunachal Pradesh, which the Chinese have always had problems about because of the nature of the Makmohan line. So because there was no consensus about where the line should be, where the border should be, India and China had a few meetings. They did not arrive at any acceptable, consensual, the word is consensual, both sides need to accept demarcation of the line where the border could be considered. As a result, India and China had a border war in October 1962. And at that time, India was clearly militarily disadvantaged. And history talks about then Indian Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru having been humiliated because of the experience with China. The Indian army, in particular, acquitted itself very, very bravely, but they were under equipped. And there were lots of other inadequacies in terms of leadership and objectives. So, as a result, there was a military setback. It was a defeat for India. And again, in keeping with how China operated, China unilaterally withdrew from the areas it had occupied. Even today's modern Assam was deemed to be under threat at one point in time of Chinese occupation. But there was a larger global context, which is that in October 1962, the world was facing or dealing with what you might call as a Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a very, very tense situation between United States, the two superpowers, United States and the former Soviet Union. Luckily for the world, that was also resolved without using nuclear weapons. But it was a very major international global event. And against that backdrop, China had carried out what it did, which was, now in retrospect, we say they tried to teach India a lesson because they felt that India was asserting itself in a manner that was not acceptable to China, which saw itself historically and potentially as the only significant power in Asia. So, from the experience of October 1962, what happened was that two things emerged. One, an unresolved territorial border dispute of almost 3,500 kilometers from the high Himalayas to the extreme east in modern Arunachal Pradesh. The second is Chinese leadership, political leadership, and their preference to teach India or any other country a lesson if they felt that the other country was behaving in a manner that was challenging the Chinese hegemony in Asia. This was the background. So, from 1963 onwards, after the Chinese withdrawal, there was no agreed demarcated border, much less an agreement about the claim lines. And when this was happening, Pakistan, which had seized one part of the erstwhile former state of Jammu and Kashmir, decided that it would cede this part of former J&K composite state to China, which is what is referred to as Aksai Chin. And China wanted this because of geography. The location of Aksai Chin, its access to Xinjiang, which is the province that China is currently having problems with because the ethnicity and the religion of Xinjiang are different. It has Muslim citizens. They are called the Uyghurs. And they in turn have had their own problems with communism. And currently it is said that China has got more than 1 million people in detention camps to ensure that there would be no internal security problem. So this is just about where we are currently. So for India, the problem is compounded that the border and territorial dispute with China, which should have been bilateral, has now acquired a third party, which is Pakistan. And therefore, from 1963 onwards, India and China actually had no formal diplomatic contact. Neither of them had the normal political diplomatic kind of contact that most major countries and particularly proximate countries have. India and China are proximate to each other. And it was only in 1988 that we resumed the diplomatic relationship when then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China, Beijing. And from 89 onwards, you might say that there has been a progressive improvement, a normalization of the relationship between India and China. I just want to add one point here that in 89, China also went through its own internal crisis, which is referred to as the Tiananmen crisis. Just last year, we had observed the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen, when students had protested wanting democracy and freedom. And they were crushed by the Chinese military and the security services. And that is the beginning of what you might call as a more authoritarian, repressive China from 1989 onwards. And it has a relevance when we talk about the current standoff. So for India, the relationship becomes more positive in terms of the orientation from 1993 onwards, when India and China enter into an agreement signed by then Indian Prime Minister Mr. Narasimha Rao, and on the Chinese side, President Jiang Zemin. This was an important, I would say, political agreement because they agreed to maintain peace and tranquility along this long line of actual control. And to the credit of both sides, from 1993 till the Galwan tragedy that took place in June 2020, not a bullet has been fired in anger across the line of actual control, and not a life has been lost, a military or a army or any border police, etc. Yes, we had an incident in 1975, but it was contained. And you might say that from 1975 officially to where we are now, 2020, this has been a very stable, peaceful line of actual control. Though the two armies have engaged in skirmishes, there are some occasions when the military was also deployed in an operational mode. But as I said, for the record, 1975 was the last time we had 4 personnel who lost their lives. And now 2020, where we had the Galwan tragedy. And even though people say that in Galwan also not a shot was fired, what were used were clubs, stones, and various other forms of lethal equipment. This time around, the nature of the standoff between India and China is very different from whatever had happened in the past. And the summary of the reasons are as follows. The first thing is that if you look at the map again, you will find that there is what is called as the Eastern Ladakh region. And that is something which abuts some of the Indian states. Now, of course, J&K has been reorganized into 2 union territories. We have Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir. So if you can see the map again, you will see the Ladakh region. And in Eastern Ladakh, we have noticed that this time around, there are multiple locations where China has moved its troops forward into areas which were never part of the Chinese claim. And this also includes Galwan Valley. So just to recap, if you look at the political agreement after 1993 and subsequent meetings, India and China had more or less tacitly accepted the notion of a line of actual control. And the line of actual control also was complemented by what is called as a claim line for the following reasons. India had its own line of actual control. If you look at, for instance, the map again, the Aksai area and where we are, the Indian line of actual control is along this particular line, which is moving down from Aksai, and it has a certain orientation from north-south. The Chinese line of actual control has been shown to be west of India. The Indian line of actual control has been shown to be east of what the Chinese are claiming as their line of actual control. And in between, along this long area, the western sector, the middle sector, the central sector, and the eastern sector, each side has also got what they call as a claim line. So this claim line falls in between the 2 lines that either side has claimed to be its own area because of historical reasons. So what has happened this time and why it is different is that from April onwards, now we know in hindsight that China had, in a way, breached the trust. The trust was earlier based on agreements between 1993 to 2006 that neither side, they would carry out patrols along the line of actual control up to their claim line, but they would not build any semi-permanent fortifications, neither would they move equipment, inventory, ammunition, etc. Until April of 2020, this was respected. India and China patrolled. Their army patrols met sometimes. Sometimes they were cordial. Sometimes they were not cordial. There was physical contact. There was jostling. We have seen all these reports. In two or three occasions, we had some slightly tense situations, and what is remembered is that most recently we had the Doklam crisis. Again, if you look at the map, you will find where Doklam is. It is in that area, the tri junction with Bhutan. And you will see that thrice in recent years, China has sent its own troops into various areas along the line of actual control. You'll remember Doklam, which, as I said, is on the tri junction with Bhutan, where again China had built roads in areas it was not supposed to. When President Xi Jinping had visited India in 2014, we had a situation where Chinese troops moved into the Chumar area. Then we also had Depsang, which is in Ladakh. That was another period when Chinese troops had moved in. But each time India and China have been able to arrive at a political diplomatic accommodation, and the status quo was, in a way, restored, except in relation to Doklam, where I would say that China has done what it is quite adept at, which is that it moves two steps forward, claims some territory. India protests and says that this is not as per the agreement. And China moves only one step back and then says, let's talk. So then the new start line for China is that it has got one step in its kitty. One territorial area has been taken by it. Now, China has followed the same kind of creeping assertiveness, as it is called, in relation to the South China Sea. If you remember the map, there is ASEAN, there is the South China Sea, where China has been having problems with some ASEAN countries, including Philippines, Indonesia, and Brunei, as also Malaysia in certain cases, and most recently with Vietnam. And there have been various, I would say, incidents where China has used its military intimidation against these countries and created artificial structures in the South China Sea, which it now claims to be its own territory. So there is a pattern of Chinese behavior. So in Doklam, that's what they did. They moved, there was a crisis, it tended to escalate. China said, let's talk. But at the end of it, now, a year later, more than a year later, they are still consolidating their infrastructure on the Chinese side in the tri-junction with Bhutan. So what the Chinese have done is that from April onwards, in a premeditated manner, they moved their troops, and I think we need to accept that there was some inadequacy on the Indian part, that the Indian intelligence or the Indian border patrols, which is the Indo-Tibetan border police and so on, were unable to either detect or discern what the Chinese were up to. And we ended up in the equivalent of a fait accompli, where the Chinese have moved into multiple locations. And for the record, in eastern Ladakh, we have something called the Pangong Lake. It is referred to as Pangong So. And China is consolidating this, by the way, is one of the high altitude lakes in the world. And China has consolidated its position over there, despite the political agreement to disengage. So let me summarize this. This particular standoff is very different from what has happened earlier. One, because of the premeditated nature in which China has moved. Two, despite an agreement at the level of the local commanders, Chinese troops had attacked an Indian army unit led by Colonel Santosh Babu of the 16 Bihar, and we had 20 deaths on the Indian side, which is very sad and tragic. Now, there are also reports of an undisclosed number of Chinese PLA personnel also having lost their lives. So this is the departure that after the Peace and Tranquility Agreement of 1993, today there is no peace, there is no tranquility. Both sides have lost lives, the Indian side more visibly, and it appears that they were ambushed because they were going to check the disengagement protocols that had been agreed to on June 6th. Obviously, there is outrage in India, there is anger. And today, in the end of June, we are in a situation where India has said that it expects China to restore the status quo. But as a security analyst, I would say that this may be challenging because tactically China is sitting in a more favorable position in the locations where it has transgressed. There doesn't appear to be any intention on their part to really disengage, in keeping with the spirit and letter of the word disengage, because most recent reports are suggesting that along the Pangong Lake, along the north and southern banks of the lake, the Chinese are consolidating their position. And again, if you look at the map, you'll find that for India, the reason why the Ladakh area is very, very important is that as you move up, there is a airstrip called DBO, Daulat Beg Oldie. And that's a very critical air asset for India, because we have landed even the heavy duty transport aircraft, what is called as the C-130. So it gives India a certain tactical cum strategic advantage in terms of the ability to use air power in that part of the tri-junction as far as India, China, and Pakistan are concerned. Now, whatever be the reasons, this is what has happened. Lives have been lost, the political trust has been breached, and in the end of June, to me, the situation looks quite tense at the diplomatic and military levels, because in a very unusual, I would say, departure from the earlier cordial relationship between India and China, India has issued very strong statements both from New Delhi, and most recently, the Indian ambassador in China, Ambassador Vikram Misri, had given an interview to a local agency where he said that the way in which China has acted has been the equivalent of a loss of trust, and India expects that China would undo the damage that has been done. And I just want to quote one line from this particular interview, which I think is very, very significant, where it has been said, and I'm paraphrasing, that if the status quo as it obtained in end March, early April is not restored, it will not just damage the peace that existed in the border areas, but can also have, quote, ripples and repercussions, unquote, in the broader bilateral relationship between India and China. Now, that is significant, because from what is ostensibly a tactical situation, that Chinese troops have moved a few kilometers or more into areas claimed by India along the line of actual control. One extreme view, which some people have voiced, is to say that these are uninhabited regions, mountainous. And at one time, Pandit Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru, had said, not a blade of grass grows here. So why are India and China getting into such a lather, so much tension? And of course, in the global commentary, once in a while, there is reference to nuclear weapons, which I think personally is totally uncalled for. India and China are both aware that the nuclear capability has no relevance when we talk about territoriality. But be that as it may, this is where the current situation is very different from anything that has happened in the past. And the fact that India is seeking a return to status quo as obtained in end March, early April. And if it doesn't happen, what next for India? I think these are areas that we can now examine about the strategic implications of what China has done by way of moving into multiple locations along eastern Ladakh, and what are the policy options for India at this stage. The larger strategic implications or the big picture. Now, one question that is often being asked is, why did China do this? Now, different voices have joined the debate in India, which is good. India is a democracy, so I think we should have different points of view. And I just want to actually make a brief reference to one very unfortunate development in the current debate in India, which is that national security and the crisis with China on the line of actual control is very unfortunately becoming a point of discord between the political parties. We have seen some very, very intemperate references, I think, as an analyst, unnecessary, unfortunate, where between the current Modi-led government, BJP-led Modi government, NDA 2, and the Congress party, and references, of course, to then Prime Minister Nehru, the family, and so on. And many, I would say, I use the word intemperate references have been made, recalling past history, which I think is undesirable when the country needs to close ranks at a political level and deal with the current challenge. We hope that will happen in the near future. But let me briefly comment on the big picture and the strategic implications. Now, we spoke about all the tactical issues, BBO, the airstrip, China, etc. Now, the question that is being posed is, why did China do this in April 2020? My own assessment is that, first of all, China found a chink. It found India, shall we say, not as alert as it should have been in those sectors. So it seized the advantage and deliberately, in a premeditated way, breached the political trust. So obviously, it wanted to improve its bargaining position or negotiating position from a position of tactical strength, and that is what China has done. Whether it will go back as it has in the past, whether it is Depsang, Chumar, Doklam, is a question mark at this point in time. Now, as to why China did it in 2020, various reasons are being given, including the fact that India had carried out a reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, and that references were made in India that Aksai Chin will be taken, and India is improving its infrastructure. India is getting close to the US. As I said, a clutch of reasons have been given. All I would like to make as a comment at this point is that whatever be the reasons, the one single takeaway is that China chose to break the trust, an agreement which had been arrived at, as I said, various agreements from 1993 to 2006. So this is empirical. China has decided that whether to teach India a lesson or whatever be its reasons, they did this particular breach of trust. Now, my own assessment is that none of these reasons that are being advanced to my mind are as valid, including the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, and now we have a new union territory, because this is an internal matter of India. Now, India never makes any comment about what China has done, for instance, in its own Xinjiang province. Now, more recently, China had carried out some administrative reorganization of the South China Sea. Now, China is seeking to impose its own domestic laws on Hong Kong because it says Hong Kong is our territory. So the point is that different countries have had different approaches about how they will deal with their domestic issues. And the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir is a domestic matter. It does not in any way threaten the sovereignty of China, nor does it have any bearing on the line of actual control on claim lines and so on. So my assessment is that China under President Xi Jinping decided that it was worth the price to break this trust with India, either to seek tactical advantage to be used in a strategic sense, or, and this is my own tentative conclusion at this point in time, that China saw this as an opportunity to again, quote unquote, teach India a lesson. Because for some time there was a perception that India is the obstacle in China's grand plan for a unipolar Asia. Now, we are aware that there is a lot of tension between China and the United States, which operates at the primary level of major powers globally. There is also a tension between China and Japan. There is a certain amount of tension between China and ASEAN countries. And now it is China and India. So clearly, President Xi Jinping and his closest advisors, to my mind, my conjecture is, they have arrived at a determination that it is worth the price, whatever be our objective. China as the sole superpower in Asia. That is the first step. A unipolar Asia with China as the single pole. Maybe they want to make a unipolar world, a Chinese, what is called as a Sinic world. The word is SINIC, that you use this for China. And they want to get there by 2049, which is 100 years of Communist China from 1949, the Great March of Mao Zedong, to 2049. Will China get there? Will it falter? Will it stumble? We don't know. One could talk about the probability, but at this point, when the world is dealing with a pandemic crisis, as an analyst, my conjecture is that just as China had utilized the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis to further its own position vis-a-vis India at that time and went ahead with the border war. I see a correspondence that the crisis of the pandemic at the global level and the uncertainty that had been engendered has been used as an opportunity by China to find this chink in the Indian border patrols and the LAC and quickly moved in. Now, my sense again is that the negotiations are going to be protracted. And even as we speak, there is a certain sense of escalation, hardening of positions, because just as China has now dug its heels in and bringing in reinforcements and troops to the Pangong Lake area, India is also strengthening its own defenses, both in Ladakh and along other parts of the line of actual control. Because China is now sitting in a more advantageous tactical position in Ladakh and along Pangong, my sense is that India would have to calibrate its own position very carefully and come back to the point that I had made in the beginning. You have to decide your political objective. What is it that India wants? Because territory by itself is not the sole political objective. There is a lot of strategic relevance to the geography of the region. Personally, I would say DBO is something where India should dig its heels in and, if need be, escalate in the conventional military sense to ensure that the road, if you look at the map again, there is a road between Daulag Oldi, the airstrip, and as you come down south into Ladakh at the Dobruk area. So it goes along a river. So you just see the map, you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. So if India loses the tactical advantage and China is able to increase the military asymmetry in its favor, and DBO is also threatened, that would be a setback for India. But that is within this sector. My larger point is that India has to define its political objective in terms of how does it want to engage with China over the next 2 decades. That is from 2020 to 2040. And this is the complex challenge, I would say, for the Modi government in particular, because they were elected on the national security plank, meaning that Prime Minister Modi was projected as a very strong leader. He also invested in the relationship with Mr. Xi Jinping at a personal level. You recall we had the Wuhan summit when Prime Minister Modi went to Wuhan for an informal summit with Mr. Xi Jinping in China. There was a reciprocal visit in 2019 when President Xi Jinping visited Mambalapuram, that is the erstwhile Mahabalipuram in Tamil Nadu. We spoke about the Wuhan spirit and the Mambalapuram spirit. That is now completely frayed. There is no trust. And therefore, it's a setback for Prime Minister Modi that his investment in China has not paid off in a positive sense. And therefore, how does India deal with China at the political level, at the military level with these setbacks? And how will it deal with China at the economic and trade level? And that's the critical question. Because the reality today is that globalization has introduced a dynamic where dependence, investments and intra-national trade within countries, among countries, is a very critical component of economic prosperity. Now, for a variety of other reasons, India has decided not to join, for instance, the major trading arrangements. In this part of the world, we have something called the RCEP. China had its own ambitious plan called the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. The United States, under President Donald Trump, has evolved a new policy about America First, which goes against the spirit of globalization and the WTO protocols. So we are, in a very uncertain domain, that the uncertainty is not only the pandemic, COVID-19, but it's also about the patterns of trade and economic engagement and relationship. Now, if you look at the big picture, all macroeconomic indicators had suggested that by the time you come to 2030, which is just a decade away, not very far, it's possible that all things being equal, the global economic pyramid will get rearranged and China may emerge as the single largest GDP, single state GDP. The United States will be a close second and India would be a distant third. Now, this period could be 2035 also, meaning that much depends on the growth rate for the world, the growth rate for these countries. The pandemic has created uncertainty Clearly, the GDP growth for many countries is going to be negative in this year till such time as the vaccine comes, recovery starts. So we don't quite know. But I'm still saying, all things being equal, whether it takes 20 years, 15 years, 22 years, between 2020 and that point, finite point in time, you could say that by and large, we will have a tripolar macroeconomic order, which is China, United States, and India. Now, to get there and ensure that the asymmetry between India and the United States, that's the number two and the number three, is not too much, India needs to be a robust trading partner with the major countries of the world and major trade groupings, which it is not. So, even in Asia, there is no South Asian trade to speak of, not that it would be very significant because South Asian economies are small economies. India needs to trade with the United States, a large trading country, a large GDP. India needs to engage with China, a large country, a large GDP. And India needs to engage with the European Union. India needs to engage with ASEAN. So you have to pick and choose your clusters or your entities where robust trade should be maintained. So when we talk about policies in the decade ahead, now there's been a very angry, emotive reaction in India. More recently, we had pictures of angry citizens of India throwing their television sets, those that were made in China, on the ground, stamping on them, and saying we will not buy products made in China and so on. Now, I think a hasty kind of policy decision like this would be inappropriate. It would also be damaging for India's long term interests, both economic, trade, and fiscal. So I think the Modi government would have to arrive at a very calibrated, objective decision spread out over the next few years, definitely for the second term of the Modi government. How do you deal with China in this post Galwan context? And I would say roughly we know what we don't want, which is impulsive, hasty decisions that, for instance, say don't trade with China, don't engage with China. Much as I said, these are emotive times. We have to recall what happened even during the Cold War between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And this is now recorded historically after the implosion of the former Soviet Union, that the diplomats on both sides say. They may not have liked each other. They may have feared each other because of the nuclear weapons. They may have despised each other for ideological reasons. The United States called the former Soviet Union the evil empire. They talked about Satan. In like fashion, Moscow, which was the capital of the former Soviet Union, was very critical of the United States, saw it as the decadent West led by the US. Yet, the two sides trusted each other. And that is the critical component. It was very valuable when both sides were managing nuclear weapons and missiles, what are called as WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Again, as an analyst, I would add that perhaps the reason why the world survived the nuclear age, the height of the nuclear age between the former Soviet Union and the United States, was because this trust was nurtured, there was no breakdown, and the various arms reduction treaties were by and large respected. For India and China, it's an anomalous situation where the trust is frayed. And whatever decisions India takes in the years ahead, one hopes that they would be composite, look at the complexity of the issue, and not make them emotional or binary. And I think this is the critical part for India in terms of what is the takeaway from Galwan. And I would summarize it as follows: that India's strategic elite, those who take decisions on behalf of the government and those who are advising the government, and the entire gene pool of people who are either government and therefore arriving at policy recommendations, or people from the outside, retired, serving, think tanks, academia, who are offering inputs. That India, alas, and I say this with a lot of regret and sadness, does not appear to have understood strategic geography, whether it's in the high Himalayas or in the maritime domain. And secondly, India does not appear to have learnt from military history. And I think these are two structural issues that need to be acknowledged and redressed as we go ahead. But this is my current assessment and understanding of the India China standoff and what could possibly be the way ahead.